The night Nora Hayes crawled through the chain-link fence at the far end of the Naval Museum's backlot, she was not thinking about history or secrets. She was thinking about her hands, which had stopped feeling like her own somewhere in the last block, and about the thermometer outside a convenience store 3 blocks back that had read 11 degrees Fahrenheit, and about the wind-off Puget Sound that was doing something to that number she understood was bad. She'd been walking for 40 minutes. The water in the plastic bottle in her backpack had gone fully solid somewhere between the parking lot where she'd slept the night before and the waterfront where the old ships sat dark and unvisited against the November sky. She'd read enough about cold exposure in library books to understand the sequence from uncomfortable to serious, and she was further along that sequence than she could afford to be choosy about. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to it. She pressed through the gap in the chain link where the ground had eroded away from the base of the fence over years of rain and neglect, the wire catching on her jacket sleeve and releasing. She had found the gap 2 days prior, working the perimeter the careful way. She always worked new spaces before she committed to anything. You checked exits before you got in. You understood the edges of a place before you put yourself at the center of it. She developed this approach around her third foster placement, in a house in Federal Way, where the older kids had explained that knowing your exits was the practical difference between caught and free. She'd spent years deciding whether that knowledge was useful or something to grieve. At 11 degrees in November in Bremerton, Washington, she leaned toward useful. She was 19 years old. She had $6.43 in the front pocket of her coat, a backpack with a zipper that had given up on one end 2 months ago, a sleeping bag rated to 32 degrees that was doing nothing at 11, and not one person in the world who knew where she was or would notice before morning if she didn't come back. The museum lot held 3 vessels. A destroyer she dismissed on first pass, 2 exposed, lit from the street on 2 sides. A patrol boat that sat low in the water and smelled worse the closer you got, something she couldn't name and didn't try to. And the submarine, the USS Beaumont. She'd read the placard through the fence 2 days prior. Commissioned 1962, decommissioned 1987, transferred to the Kitsap Naval Heritage Foundation in 1991 for preservation and public display. The public display had ended when the county cut the foundation's operating budget in 2019 because the lot was locked and dark and had the particular quiet of somewhere nobody came to check on anymore. The kind of quiet that meant she had time. The Beaumont sat in a concrete dry dock at the far end of the property. From the fence, she had underestimated her. Up close, the submarine was longer than a football field, her hull curved and salt-stained, patchworked with paint touch-ups applied over the years in slightly different shades of the same dark color, as if someone had tried to maintain the exterior with whatever they could source and had run out of something before the job was done. Someone had tried. They had stopped. The Beaumont had been sitting in her dry dock ever since, collecting years, waiting out the argument about what came next for her. Nora stood in front of the submarine for a moment in the cold and breathed fog into the dark air. There was a word for what she felt looking at that hull, but she had learned to be careful with certain words over the past 4 months. Hope was one of them. Used too freely, it became expensive, and she'd already paid for it more times than she could afford. She chose a smaller word instead, something she could cover with what she had. Possibility. She found a right hatch on the 3rd try. The forward torpedo loading hatch at the bow was rusted so completely into its frame that she couldn't have moved it without equipment she didn't have. A hull access hatch above the engine room was similarly seized, corroded shut with the permanence that comes from decades of salt air and no maintenance. The conning tower hatch at the top of a ladder bolted to the curved hull opened on one firm pull, a single low groan of metal that had been held shut for years and gave way all at once, the way things do when they've been waiting long enough for permission to change. She climbed through, pulled the hatch shut behind her, and sat on the metal floor of the compartment in the dark with her back against the ladder. No wind. The cold was still there, but the wind was gone, and that was the difference between a night she could survive and one that went badly. She stayed on the floor for 3 full minutes, just breathing, letting her body register the change. Then she unclipped the headlamp from her bag and turned it on and began to learn a boat. The conning tower compartment was cramped and largely stripped, the periscope housing intact, but most instrumentation removed, cables hanging loose from conduits in the ceiling where equipment had been pulled out and carted away during the decommissioning process. She moved through the base hatch and down a ladder into the control room, a larger space packed with the skeleton of what had once been a functioning command center. Instrument panels with gauges still in their housings, but the mechanisms behind them gone. Chart tables bolted to the deck. A compass on a pedestal in the center of the room, holding its last heading as if the mission hadn't quite ended. The needles of the remaining gauges were frozen at their final readings, numbers that hadn't meant anything since 1987. She stood in front of one of those panels for a long time, looking at the frozen needles. She thought about the last person who had stood here when the numbers still carried weight behind them, and about what it meant when a working vessel became a monument, and about whether things carried their previous lives with them in ways you couldn't detect until you were close. Enough to feel the residue. She moved through the boat the way the retired contractor named Frank Morrison had once shown her to move through a questionable building. Test the deck plates before you commit your weight. Listen for flex in the metal before you step. Check for rust through at the seams and corners before you trust a floor. She'd met Frank at a Salvation Army dinner in Tacoma 4 months ago, a man with a face like old work leather who'd spent 40 unasked for minutes explaining structural integrity over split pea soup in the tone of someone who'd spent a career watching people ignore this information and then pay for it later. At the time, she'd wanted him to stop talking. Now, the information was keeping her on her feet in a submarine built in 1962 that nobody had walked through in years. The compartments connected through hatches set in the bulkheads at stomach height, each roughly the size and shape of a front-loading washing machine door at an angle that made the geometry feel different every time. Step through with one leg first, rotate the hips, duck the head, all as one motion. Too slow, and the frame edge caught your shin. She learned this twice before her body worked out the sequence without instruction. The forward torpedo room at the bow was the largest compartment, oval in cross-section, with bunks built into the curved walls alongside the torpedo tube housings. The crew who'd served here during the Beaumont's active years had slept 6 inches from live weapons. They'd eaten at folding tables set between the tubes, written letters home perched on the casings. She'd read about this once in a magazine at a waiting room during a period when someone else scheduled her appointments. The claustrophobia of it had struck her then. Now, standing in the actual space with her headlamp throwing shadows up the curve hull, what struck her was that the room was roughly the same size as the bedroom she'd shared with 2 other girls at the Henderson placement in Puyallup, and considerably quieter than that room had been. The Henderson placement had been loud in specific ways she didn't think about directly if she could help it. She spread her sleeping bag on one of the lower bunks. The mattress was long gone, the frame rough with old paint, but the bunk rails kept the bag from sliding and the curve of the hull was solid against her back. She turned off the headlamp. The darkness was absolute in the way that only enclosed metal produces, complete and total and unexpectedly peaceful when nothing outside could reach you. She slept better than she had in 6 weeks. Nora had been homeless for 4 months and 21 days when she found the Beaumont, and she'd spent the first month refusing to use that word for what was happening. She was in a transitional period, between situations, figuring out the next step. The vocabulary of not quite admitting lasted through several weeks, and then collapsed one night in a Seattle parking structure when rain was coming through a crack in the concrete above her, and she woke at 3 in the morning with the particular clarity that hours sometimes delivers, the kind that strips language down to what things actually are, and understood that the word for her situation was the one she'd been navigating around for 4 weeks. She'd aged out of Washington State foster care the previous August, 3 weeks past her 19th birthday. The exit package from the independent living program was $1,200, a garbage bag containing everything she owned, and a congratulations from her final caseworker that it felt less like celebration and more like a door being closed from the other side. The statistic she knew because a different caseworker had shared it with her a year earlier, not unkindly, just matter-of-factly, in the way of someone who told this to everyone as a matter of professional honesty. 40% of young people who aged out of the foster system experience homelessness within the first 2 years of their exit date. She'd filed it away the way she filed most information about herself that she couldn't immediately act on. By October, she was in the 40%. Her mother had died when Nora was 16. Kidney failure, which sounds gradual and measured, but at the end had been neither of those things. She'd been placed with a family in Federal Way initially, genuinely kind people managing more than they'd taken on, and then moved twice more as placements fell through for reasons explained in careful language that meant something went wrong without anyone being specific about what. She'd learned to read the signs early. Caseworkers who called and chose their words with unusual deliberateness. Adults who didn't quite meet her eyes when they delivered information. She'd started packing before people knocked, because being ready was better than scrambling, and the habit had stayed with her across every move since then and was still with her now. In the backpack, she kept organized by importance, even when everything else wasn't. Her father was a name on a form. She'd tried once to find him, spent $4 on library printing costs, and came up empty in a way that felt conclusive. She decided afterward to treat this as information the universe was protecting her from rather than something she'd failed to locate, and let it go. What she had instead was a capacity for surviving things that seemed designed to break her. She'd finished high school, not easily, and not without nights of homework done in diner booze over 60-cent coffee. One order stretched across 3 hours because the warmth and the outlet access were the actual purchases, and the coffee was incidental to both. She'd graduated with grades that meant something and a plan to attend Tacoma Community College in the fall. The plan held until late August, when $1,200 ran out faster than she'd calculated, because the calculations hadn't accounted for what things actually cost when you had no buffer under you. No family couch to land on when the numbers went wrong. No rental history to convince a landlord you were worth the risk. No one to call when the gap between working and stable turned out to be wider than she'd understood from outside it. The plan came apart. She started surviving instead. She wanted. It noted in her own accounting of herself that she had worked every job she could find and hold. Dishes at a Thai restaurant in Belltown until the owner's nephew needed the position. Night stocking at a grocery store until they cut hours below the point where bus fare exceeded shift pay. Hotel rooms cleaned floor by floor until that contract ended. 3 weeks of produce picking in the Yakima Valley in October, cash payment, a field camp that closed with a harvest. She worked, and her circumstances declined anyway, because working and stable are not the same thing, and crossing from one to the other requires a foothold she hadn't been able to locate. Bremerton had not been a plan. She'd taken a ferry across Puget Sound on a transit pass expiring in 2 days because she'd heard about a shelter without county residency requirements, and because Seattle had started to feel like a city in the active process of deciding she wasn't part of it. The shelter had a 45-person wait list. She'd added her name and looked for somewhere to wait. She'd found the fence, the gap, the Beaumont. And for the first time in longer than felt safe to examine directly, she had somewhere that was hers. She'd had 3 placements she remembered clearly, and 2 she'd mostly put away. The Hendersons in Puyallup were the longest, 14 months, and in many ways the best. 2 adults who ran a tight household and expected the children in it to pull their weight, which Nora had found she preferred over kindness she didn't know what to do with. They'd lost their contract renewal over something bureaucratic she'd never been fully explained, and the ending had been abrupt in the way endings in the system always were, one Friday afternoon with 2 hours' notice. She'd left a library book she'd borrowed and never returned it, and that had bothered her for years afterward out of proportion to its actual significance. The last placement before aging out had been with a couple named Reyes in Tacoma who were doing their genuine best with too many kids and not enough hours in the day. She'd been one of 4 in that house, the oldest by 3 years, which meant she'd ended up functioning as something between a sibling and a junior caregiver, a role she hadn't asked for but had accepted because refusing it would have made things worse for the smaller ones. She'd read to the youngest 2 every night before bed, picking out books from the library's picture section and doing different voices for each character. The youngest one had called her Nori, a name no one else had ever used, and she'd carried that name in a small sealed pocket of her memory ever since, not taking it out too often because some things were worth preserving through careful handling. What nobody told you about aging out, or what they told you in statistics and pamphlets rather than in the practical language of actual experience, was that the loss wasn't just material. It wasn't only the money running out faster than expected, though that happened too. It was the sudden removal of structure, the way days stopped having a shape, the way every decision that had previously been made by someone else was now yours and only yours and came without any framework for making it. She'd been 19 years old in August with nowhere to be on a Tuesday at 2 p.m., and the freedom of that had lasted about 4 days before she understood it as something closer to its opposite. She tried to reach back out to her last caseworker in September, when the money was getting thin and the options were narrowing. The caseworker had been kind on the phone, genuinely so, had provided numbers and resources and names of programs she'd already tried. The conversation had ended with an expression of genuine hope for Nora's future that felt like being handed a map of a country you'd already left. She'd stopped calling after that. You learned which calls were worth making. She stayed inside for 4 days before going back into town, and it was a clear calculation rather than recklessness. The risks of her situation were real. The museum lot was private property. The submarine was not hers. And if the wrong person noticed the conning tower hatch sitting differently from how it had been, the situation would resolve badly in ways that closed off options she couldn't afford to lose. She had a trespassing conversation with a church facilities manager earlier that year and had no interest in finding out what one looked like with a sheriff involved. But the forecast held 2 nights of hard rain. The temperature wasn't rising. 45 people were ahead of her on the shelter wait list. She had $6.43 and the protein bars and crackers she'd had in her bag when she arrived, and those were the terms of her available options. She stayed. She rationed everything carefully across 4 days. She slept in the torpedo room bunk and woke each morning to cold that was not as cold as the wind outside, and that difference was the one that mattered. She used the days to know the boat. Every compartment, slowly, hands and headlamp together. The engine room at the aft end still held 2 massive diesel engines on their mounting pads, the electrical generation equipment stripped away, but the engines themselves left behind, probably because removing them wasn't worth the cost to anyone. They were the size of trucks, built into a room designed specifically around them, with every cubic inch of space accounted for. She spent an hour there on the second day, doing nothing but looking and touching the cast iron housings, trying to understand the logic of building something this large for a space this confined, engineering a vessel around its own engines rather than the other way around. The logic was something she could feel around the edges of without quite reaching the center. The control room she came back to several times. Enough remained to give the space its original character. Gauges with needles frozen at final readings. Chart tables bolted to the deck. That compass still holding its last heading. She opened the logbook on the 3rd day, carefully, the pages stiff and water-swollen but readable. Service record in official notation, departure dates, arrival ports, depth readings, nothing human anywhere except for 1 page near the back where an engineering officer had pressed a fern leaf between the pages and written nothing beside it. She didn't know what that meant. She put it back exactly as she'd found it. The aft torpedo room mirrored the forward one in shape, but felt different in character, less confined, more exposed, the kind of space where men had worked with their sleeves rolled up and their minds occupied with mechanics rather than sleep. She found a logbook mount on the wall, empty, and 2 coffee mugs still in a rack above a workbench, as if someone had simply stepped away for a moment and not yet come back. She stood there for a while, looking at those mugs. They were an ordinary beige with a Navy anchor printed in blue, mass-produced, identical to 10,000 other mugs on 10,000 other Navy vessels. But they were also the most human objects she'd encountered in the whole boat, proof of men taking breaks, filling cups, standing in this exact spot, and thinking about something other than the mission. She didn't touch them. She spent time in the officers' quarters, a slightly larger compartment than the crew bunks with slightly narrower bunks. The distinction carrying the careful hierarchy of a confined world where every inch of space was both functional and symbolic. She found a photograph frame, empty, the glass cracked, lying on one of the shelves. Someone had taken the photograph with them when they left, or it had been removed during the decommissioning, but the frame remained, and she picked it up and looked at the rectangular space where the image had been and thought about what it would have held. Family, most likely. A wife, children, a dog, a house with a driveway. The visible evidence of a world worth returning to. She put the frame back. She went back to the torpedo room. She pulled her sleeping bag up to her chin in the lower bunk and listened to the silence and the faint sound of water somewhere. Rain beginning on the hull. A drumming that traveled through the steel and became something almost musical by the time it reached her. She was not comfortable. She was warm enough to survive, and she had a roof over her head, and no one knew where she was. And that last part was sometimes the most important part of all. She thought about the word home, which she had not used without qualification since she was 15 years old. The last Christmas at her mother's apartment before everything changed. The smell of the particular cedar candle her mother kept on the windowsill, and the way the light came through the glass and made the whole place look golden for about 40 minutes around 4 in the afternoon in December. She hadn't looked for a home since then. She'd looked for places. The Beaumont was a place. But lying there in the dark with the rain on the hull and the absolute stillness everywhere else, she thought it might be something more than that, and she fell asleep before she could decide whether that thought was dangerous or not. On the fourth morning, she went back through the fence and spent most of her remaining money at the dollar store on soup and rice cakes, and bought a phone card out of pure reflex, the habit of months ago when a phone was essential, and stood outside the store looking at it before putting it in her pocket because throwing it away felt like making the mistake from a different angle. At the shelter office, the list had moved by 41 names ahead of her now. She left her number with the caseworker and walked back toward the museum lot. She stopped at a coffee shop with a handwritten sign in the window. Overnight cleaning help wanted, cash inquire inside. 5 minutes with a man named Pete, and she had a job. 3 nights a week, 2 hours per night, $11 an hour in cash from a lockbox under the counter. The motel work came 2 weeks after that through a woman named Carla, who ran the Hampton Inn on 6th with the efficiency of someone who'd built the operation herself and wasn't inclined to let it slip. 8 hours, minimum wage, cash on Fridays, no questions about her address. She started the following Monday and settled into the shape of days built from her own effort. Sleep in the torpedo room from midnight to 7. Pete's coffee shop in the morning, where he gave her the first cup free on a logic he expressed once and never repeated. Library in the afternoon. Back to the boat. Motel shift. She kept the conning tower hatch latched as she'd found it. She was deliberate about her timing. She started, slowly and with the particular caution of someone who'd learned not to trust good things too quickly, to feel like a person who had a place. The regulars at Pete's coffee shop showed up every morning because routine was what held the rest of their days together, and she understood this because it was also true of her. Over 3 weeks, she learned their patterns the way she learned all shared spaces, carefully by observation, without announcing she was paying attention. Dale arrived at 8 with a crossword and stayed until noon, working through it at the pace of someone who wanted the experience to last. He was in his mid-60s, retired Navy, not from the Beaumont specifically, but from a similar vessel out of Bremerton in the early 70s, and the submarine in the museum lot occupied a corner of his attention he couldn't seem to vacate. He talked about it the way some people talked about a life that had happened nearby, without quite including them. Barb behind the counter had developed a one-word response for when he started on this particular subject. Just his name, said in a tone that communicated she'd heard it before, would hear it again, and had made a private peace with this being the shape of weekday mornings. Thing about those gaps in the cargo logs, Dale said one Tuesday, his pencil hovering above 17 across, is that they're not even classified anymore. They're just absent, as if someone filed incomplete records and no one ever came back to fill them. Friend of mine spent 22 years in naval intelligence. Retired out of Washington, went to the archives in D.C. specifically because I asked him to pull the Beaumont's Cold War files. He came back saying the gaps were in a particular section, not the operational logs, the cargo manifests, both gaps in early 80s North Pacific deployments. Dale, said Barb, I'm presenting documented fact. Submarines in that era were used as transport vessels for material that couldn't move through conventional channels. Things that needed to travel without creating a visible record. You keep an operation deniable by not logging what the vessel was actually carrying. For those two deployments, the cargo sections are simply gone, filed as exceptions, with a notation that additional documentation was held at command level. That documentation no longer exists anywhere in the public record. Vera at the corner table poured a bit more cream into her coffee without looking up. Dale went back to his crossword. Nora finished her coffee without changing her expression, thanked Pete, and walked out into the cold. She spent the block and a half back to the museum lot turning what she'd heard against everything she'd seen inside the Beaumont, specifically against the hatch at the forward end of the torpedo room that had been sitting in a corner of her thinking for 2 weeks without her quite letting herself look at it directly. She noticed it on her third day aboard and filed it away, told herself it was another rusted-shut access point in the same category as the exterior hatches she'd dismissed on the first night. But it kept surfacing in her thinking the way specific details do when your mind has already processed them as significant before the rest of you has caught up to the conclusion. Vera was a retired schoolteacher, still sharp as a blade, who ate half her breakfast and left the rest in a ritual that Nora had watched long enough to understand was less about appetite than principle, some private statement directed at no one in particular. She'd acknowledged Nora after the second week with a single nod that carried more weight than most sentences, the nod of someone who recognized a specific kind of person and chose to respect them with silence rather than questions. There was also a man named Carl who came in 3 times a week and always sat near the window and always ordered the same thing and never spoke to anyone, and a young woman named Destiny who worked the morning rush with Barb and had been saving to go to cosmetology school for 2 years and was 9 months away now, according to what Nora had overheard. The kind of overheard detail that stuck because she understood what 9 months away from something felt like and what it cost to stay focused on it. These were the people who made a place feel real. Not the building, not the coffee, but the accumulation of specific habits, the daily rehearsal of small choices, the way a regular order became a kind of language between customer and counter that meant nothing to anyone outside it, and everything to the people inside. She'd been part of systems like this in every town she'd passed through, briefly, as a passing face who didn't quite belong yet. The difference now was that she was returning. She was becoming, through the modest repetition of showing up every morning, someone the counter staff recognized. That recognition was not nothing. After months of being invisible, it was close to everything. Pete had asked her once, with the directness of someone who ran a business on early mornings and didn't have patience for indirection, whether she had somewhere stable to stay. She'd said yes without elaborating. He'd accepted this and never asked again, which was its own kind of respect. He left the first coffee free every morning and said nothing about it. She went back and examined it properly on a Sunday, when the rain had finally stopped, her headlamp aimed to give the best light she could manage, crouched at the forward end of the torpedo room with the intention of deciding what she was actually looking at. The hatch was different from every other hatch on the boat, not in a way that announced itself, but she was looking with intention now, and the differences were clear. The wheel had 8 spokes where the standard configuration had 6. She verified this by going through the entire boat and checking every other hatch before returning here to compare. The bolt heads securing the frame to the bulkhead were a different generation of hardware than the surrounding structure, subtly different in shape and size, the kind of discrepancy only visible when you had a reference point. The frame itself showed an oxidation pattern different from the older steel on either side, newer metal integrated in an infrastructure that had already been aging for 20 years when this hatch was installed. Someone had put this hatch here long after the submarine was built. She found a 1987 maintenance manual in the control room's storage locker 3 days later, tucked behind a water-swollen navigation chart in a locker that still latched. A decommissioning-era hardware specification document. She read it by headlamp until she found the hatch hardware section, and the bolt configuration and spoke count described for standard-issue hatches did not match what she was looking at in the torpedo room. The hatch post-dated the manual. It had been installed after the manual was written. She pressed her thumbnail into the surface of the wheel in 2 places and felt resistance that wasn't quite the texture of deep rust. Something firmer and more uniform underneath. Something applied with the intention of preventing corrosion rather than simply aging into it. She pressed harder in a 3rd spot and got the same result. The wheel had been coated deliberately, treated with something designed to keep the mechanism functional over a long time. Preserved, not abandoned. She put both hands on the wheel and tried to turn it. Nothing moved. She adjusted her stance and put her full weight behind it. Still nothing. Then she braced her back against the opposite bulkhead and pushed with everything she had. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. And heard from inside the wheel housing a sound so faint she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. A low groan of metal against metal. The sound of something that had been perfectly still for a very long time, being reminded that it could move. She stopped. The sound had happened. The wheel was not permanently fused to its frame. It had shifted a fraction too small to see, and that fraction told her the mechanism was intact. With the right tool and the right technique, the hatch would open. She sat on the torpedo room floor with her headlamp aimed at the hatch end. Ran through what she actually knew. Non-standard hardware, installed during the 1987 decommissioning maintenance period at Bangor. Preservation treatment on the wheel. The maintenance manual that predated the installation. Dale's account of cargo manifests with deliberate gaps for 2 North Pacific deployments in the early 80s. A retired naval intelligence contact who had confirmed the missing sections were specifically cargo records, not operational logs. She told herself 3 times, firmly, that she was not going to get fixated on this, that there was a mundane explanation, that she had enough real problems without adding mysteries to them. It didn't hold for even a full day. She found a second reference in a 1986 Naval Affairs journal she tracked down through the library's interlibrary loan system, a dry academic article about submarine modifications during the Cold War's final decade that mentioned, in passing, the practice of installing non-standard compartment hardware for specialized missions. The article was vague where she needed it to be specific, but it confirmed that what she was seeing wasn't impossible. It was the kind of modification that happened, documented in the academic record as a category, even if the specific instances remain classified. She made a list of what she was certain of and what she was inferring. Certain, the hatch was non-standard, installed during or after March 1987, treated with preservation coating, the wheel mechanism still functional. Inferring, the installation was deliberate and purposeful, carried out by someone with the knowledge and access to do it properly, sealed with the expectation that it would remain sealed for a long time. Possibly inferring to the point of speculation, that what was behind the hatch was connected to the cargo manifest gaps Dale had mentioned, that those gaps were gaps for a reason, that whatever reason was significant enough to warrant 36 years of silence. She wrote these lists out on the backs of library receipts, which she then tore up and threw away in separate garbage bins. This was perhaps overly cautious. She did it anyway. The library's microfilm collection included issues of the Bremerton Patriot back to 1949, and she spent 2 afternoons in the microfilm room going through the 1987 issues methodically, looking for anything that referenced the Beaumont's final maintenance period beyond the decommissioning ceremony coverage. She found nothing new, which itself told her something. If anything unusual had happened at Bangor during those 3 months, it had generated no public record. That could mean nothing had happened. It could mean something had happened very carefully. She was aware, as she sat in the microfilm room with the whirring machine and the yellowed archive pages scrolling past, that she might be constructing a story from fragments that didn't connect. She'd read enough true crime in waiting rooms and break rooms to know that this was how false conclusions happened. You found the fragments that fit the shape you were already imagining, and you stopped looking for the ones that didn't. She tried to hold this awareness as she worked. It was genuinely possible the hatch covered a storage compartment for maintenance equipment sealed during decommissioning because someone had been thorough about their paperwork. It was genuinely possible the cargo manifest gaps were gaps because someone had filed carelessly and no one had bothered to correct the record. It was possible that all of this was nothing. She went back to the Beaumont and tried the wheel again and felt the fraction of movement and thought. It's possible. But so is the other thing. She went to the library and pulled newspaper archive record for the Beaumont through the digital database until she found the Bremerton Patriots coverage of the 1987 decommissioning ceremony. Third paragraph, a reference to a final 3-month maintenance period at Naval Base Kitsap in Bangor, March through May of 1987, described as standard pre-transfer preparation. She checked the date on the maintenance manual. March 1987. The manual was written at the beginning of those 3 months. Whatever were produced at hatch had happened during or after that same window, in a naval yard, by someone with the right access and the right knowledge, and enough activity happening around them that one additional task on the work order would disappear into the noise of 100 others. She went back to the Beaumont that evening and tried the wheel again. Same fraction, no more. She stood with both hands still on it and made a decision. She was not leaving this boat until she knew what was behind that hatch. She would find the right tool. She would figure out the rest from there. She'd been making calculations like this since she was 16 with a garbage bag and nowhere to go, and she'd gotten this far on them, which was further than most people had predicted. On a Tuesday morning, she was later than usual coming back through the fence gap after a motel shift that ran over by an hour. She had convenience store coffee in one hand and $2 store soup cans under her arm and was tired enough to be careless about her timing, and she walked directly into the line of sight of the man, standing 40 feet away in the museum lot. He had the calm of someone who had been expecting this particular moment for a while and had decided not to make it theatrical. Mid-60s, close-cropped gray hair. A cane he used with the brisk impatience of someone who'd accepted it before he was ready. A Navy veteran's cap worn soft from years of use. A jacket from a military surplus store that had clearly never been anything else. A key ring in his hand with enough keys on it to mean real authority over this property. She ran her options fast. If she ran, she left the soup. She'd spent $1.80 on the soup and already decided she needed it. That kind of math told you where things stood without decoration. He spoke first. You've been sleeping in her. A statement, not a question, delivered without accusation. Nora said nothing and waited, which was what she did when she didn't yet have enough information to know which way a situation was going. It's all right, he said. Board's been ignoring this lot for years. I've been watching it long enough to know someone would figure out the forward hatch eventually. A pause. How long? About 3 weeks. He nodded, looked at the submarine the way you look at something you've carried with you for a long time. Then back at her. Raymond Cho. Served on the Beaumont from 79 to 84. Foundation board. For members, no restoration money. He adjusted his grip on the cane. You're working. The motel smell on your jacket, says the Hampton on 6th. She let that pass without confirming it. The hatch at the forward end of the torpedo room, Raymond said. You try to open it. I noticed it was different from the others. It is different. He was quiet long enough that she could see him arrive at a decision the way you see someone reach the edge of something they've been circling for a very long time. That hatch was installed in March of 1987, during the Bangor maintenance period. I helped put it in, along with 2 other men who are both dead now. 3 days of work. Nobody asked about it, because during decommissioning processing, there were always 100 tasks running simultaneously, and adding one more to the work order was simple if you knew how to route the paperwork. We knew how. The man who gave us the task had taught us. The air off the sound was very still. I've been on this board for 11 years, Raymond continued, watching this boat sit while the county argues about scrap value and the interest in restoring her goes to nothing. And I've been thinking lately that I don't have the luxury of another 5 years of waiting. He looked at the Beaumont again, with something complicated in his expression, the look of someone who's watched a thing deteriorate that they weren't able to stop. I've also been thinking for quite a while about who the right person is to know what's behind that hatch. He paused. Let a moment settle between them. The wheel moved when you tried it, he said. Not a question. She hadn't heard him on the boat. The realization moved through her quietly. Yes, she said. Good. Means the seal held 36 years, which is what we built it to do. Something settled in his expression, a decision that had been approaching for a long time finally landing. What's behind that hatch was placed there because the alternative was that it would be absorbed into institutional processes that bury things and call the burial administrative procedure. A senior officer I served under spent 5 years after his retirement watching the political landscape and concluded that the only genuinely safe place for what we'd recovered was somewhere nobody would think to look. Somewhere that could sit long enough that the people who'd want intercepted had retired or died or moved their attention elsewhere. He paused. He stood there looking at the submarine for a long moment before he spoke again, and she watched him with the particular attention she brought to people who were deciding whether to trust someone. She learned that trust wasn't a single decision, but a sequence of them, each one opening a smaller door before the larger one. And Raymond Cho was working through a sequence now in the cold morning air with the key ring in his hand and the veteran's cap sitting straight on his gray hair. I want to ask you something, he said, still looking at the boat, and I want you to answer it honestly because I'm going to be able to tell if you don't. Not as a threat. I've just spent too many years reading people to miss it when someone's giving me a performance rather than an answer. She waited. You've been in there 3 weeks. You've been working. You've been careful. You haven't damaged anything. You haven't told anyone. He turned to look at her. Why not? Most people who found what you found would have called someone by now. Posted about it at minimum. Why haven't you? She considered this. The honest answer had several layers, and she picked the one that felt most accurate. Because I didn't know what I'd found, and I don't announce things I don't understand yet. And because whatever it was, it seemed like it had been deliberately kept quiet, and I wasn't going to be the one to undo that before I knew what the reason was. Raymond looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slow, the way you nod when someone has said the thing you were hoping they'd say rather than the thing you were afraid of. The 2 other men who helped me install that hatch, he said. Petty Officer James Lutter died of cancer in 2011. Chief Machinist Walt Greer had a stroke in 2018 and didn't make it through the week. So it's just me now. 3 men who knew and only me left. And I've had 11 years on this foundation board watching this property slowly fall apart while I waited to figure out what the right thing to do was. He moved to one of the concrete barriers at the edge of the dry dock and sat on it heavily, the cane across his knees, and looked at the hull of the Beaumont from this lower angle, the way you look at something you've known from every possible angle and still find new dimensions in. Ashworth was a good man, Raymond said. He made a hard call in a hard situation, and he made it the right way, which is to say he thought about it for 5 years before he acted on it. He weighed who would benefit and who would be harmed, and he waited again and again until he was sure. And then he called 3 sailors he trusted and asked them to help him do something that wasn't in any manual and wasn't going to be written down, and they did it because they trusted him back. He paused. I've been trying to honor that trust for 36 years. The problem is that honoring it by doing nothing isn't quite the same as honoring it by doing something, and the longer I wait, the more it starts to look like the same thing. The morning light was coming off the sound and hitting the hull of the Beaumont at a low angle and making the patchwork paint visible in a way that was almost beautiful, the different shades recording years of effort and care and eventually the absence of both. In the spring of 1982, the Beaumont ran a classified operation in the North Pacific. The official log records a surveillance patrol. The cargo manifest was filed incomplete, with a notation that additional documentation was held at command level. That documentation was destroyed in 1986. What remains is what we move from a contact vessel to the Beaumont's forward torpedo bay, under direct orders from Commander David Ashworth, who retired the following year and died in 1994, and who spent 5 years in between deciding what a person was supposed to do with what we'd brought aboard when the institutions that should have handled it couldn't be trusted to handle it without making it vanish permanently. He stopped, let the weight of it settle in the cold air between them. There are 847 gold bars behind that hatch. Nora, recovered from a Soviet research vessel that went down in international waters in 1982 during an operation that never appeared in any official record on either side of the Cold War. Gold that was never logged, never reported, never acknowledged by any government on Earth. Ashworth's conclusion, after 5 years of consideration, was that the right course was to seal it somewhere secure and wait for someone with no institutional loyalty and no reason to bury it to bring it forward. Someone who had nothing to protect and everything to gain by telling the truth. He stopped speaking. The Beaumont sat in her dry dock behind them, 36 years of patient waiting written into every line of her salt-stained hull, every patch of mismatched paint, every sealed hatch and silent compartment. Nora stood with her soup and her coffee and looked at the man with the cane and the worn cap and the face of someone who had been carrying something extremely heavy for an extremely long time and had arrived, finally, at the point of setting it down. She thought about the gap in the fence, the hatch that opened on one pull, the wheel that had moved under her hands. She thought about 4 months and 21 days and $6.43 in a sleeping bag that wasn't enough. She thought about 847 gold bars and what the current market would call them and what a person with no fixed address and no remaining options was supposed to do when that information was placed in her hands. She thought about Dale at the coffee shop, talking about cargo manifests with deliberate gaps, about a retired naval intelligence contact who'd come back from Washington, D.C. with confirmation that the missing sections were specifically cargo records. She thought about the fern leaf pressed into the logbook by an engineering officer who may or may not have known what the boat was carrying when he pressed it flat, and about what it meant to leave something beautiful inside a record of facts. She thought about the shelter wait list with 41 names ahead of hers, about the Hampton Inn on 6th and Pete's coffee shop and the $1.80 soup and the phone card she'd bought out of Reflex and the long, slow math of a life spent getting by on the margins of other people's margins. She thought about what it meant to have spent 19 years being handed the smallest version of every possibility, and whether the smallest version was always the one that was meant for you, or whether sometimes the world just got it wrong and kept getting it wrong until someone refused to let it. Then she did the only calculation that made sense given what she'd been handed. "How do we open it?" she asked. Raymond Cho looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression that was older and more complicated than a smile, the particular quality of a man who has spent decades waiting to hand something to the right person and has finally, after all that time, found her standing in front of him holding soup and coffee, and the kind of determination that only comes from having very little left to lose. "I've been waiting 36 years to answer that question," he said. "Come with me." Raymond Cho's truck was a 15-year-old Tacoma parked in the lot 2 blocks from the museum gate, the bed carrying a tool bag and a folded tarp and a plastic storage box that had clearly been riding there for a long time. He walked to it without explanation, unlocked the tailgate with a key rather than a remote, and pulled the storage box out with the practiced motion of someone who'd lifted it in and out more times than they counted. He sat on the tailgate and looked at Nora. "Before we do anything else," he said, "I want to show you something." She put her soup and her coffee on the wheel well and waited while he worked the latches. The box was the kind you could buy at any hardware store, gray plastic, waterproof seals, nothing remarkable about it. The contents were a different story. File folders, sealed in individual plastic document sleeves, arranged in a way that suggested long-term organization rather than casual storage. Several small notebooks with water-resistant covers. A canvas roll tied with cord that contained, when he unrolled it and spread it across the tailgate, What appear to be technical drawings, hand-rendered, the kind produced by someone who understood structural engineering in a way you only understood it by doing it yourself. "I've been sitting with this material for 36 years, Raymond said. Moving it from house to house when I've moved. Updating the documentation as things changed. Waiting for a moment when the documentation mattered to someone who could use it." He looked at her steadily. "I need to know before we go any further whether you understand what you're getting into. Not the gold, the everything else that comes attached to the gold. Because once you know the full story, you're part of it. And there's no version of being part of it that doesn't require you to make a choice about what you do next." Nora looked at the box. She looked at the truck, at the museum lot visible at the end of the block, at the gray November morning that had gone still around them in a way that felt almost theatrical. She thought about 41 names on a shelter wait list and $6.43 and all the choices she'd already made that had brought her to this specific moment. She thought about the wheel that moved under her hands. "Tell me," she said. "Then I'll tell you if I'm in." Raymond pulled out the first file folder and opened it on the tailgate. Commander David Ashworth had commanded the USS Beaumont for 4 years before the North Pacific deployment of spring 1982. By all available accounts, he was the kind of naval officer the institution produced in its best moments. Methodical, precise, genuinely respected by the men under his command. The type of commander who knew his crew's family situations and their professional ambitions and treated both with equal seriousness. He'd earned his command through 2 decades of exemplary service, and he'd spent those decades doing exactly what the Navy asked him to do, without embellishment and without complaint. What happened in April of 1982 was not something the Navy had asked him to do. The Beaumont was running a standard listening patrol along an established route in the North Pacific, the kind of surveillance work that formed the unglamorous backbone of Cold War submarine operations. They were tracking signal traffic from Soviet vessels operating in the region, logging data, staying quiet, doing the work that nobody would ever hear about and that nobody was meant to hear about. Standard. Routine. The kind of deployment that ended with a complete log and a full debrief and then filed away in a record that nobody would ever declassify because nothing remarkable had happened. Then, at approximately 0340 hours on April 14th, 1982, the Beaumont sonar operator picked up something remarkable. The vessel was the academic Polzanov, a Soviet research ship operating under civilian registry, nominally on a marine survey mission in international waters 300 miles northeast of the Japanese coastline. The Beaumont had tracked her before, knew her acoustic signature, knew her patrol pattern. What the sonar operator registered was that the Polzanov signature had changed. The vessel was taking on water. Fast. Ashworth brought the Beaumont to periscope depth and observed through the scope for 11 minutes before making his call. The Polzanov was going down by the bow, stern rising. The crew was abandoning the vessel. Lifeboats in the water, distress signals that the Beaumont was monitoring but could not acknowledge without revealing their presence in waters they were technically not supposed to be in. The whole scene was happening in the dark, in the cold, 300 miles from any other vessel in any direction. What the periscope also showed, which Ashworth noted in his personal log, and which never appeared in the official record, was that the Polzanov was carrying cargo that did not match her civilian survey mission profile. Crates visible on the aft deck, military grade by their construction, being transferred to the lifeboats by men who were not acting like scientists abandoning a sinking research vessel. They were acting like men trying to save something specific. They didn't save it. The aft deck went under before the transfer was complete. The lifeboats pulled away. The Polzanov went down in approximately 4 minutes, which by any measure was fast. Ashworth had a decision to make. He made it in about 30 seconds, which was, Raymond told Nora, characteristic of him. He didn't agonize over things once the relevant information was in front of him. He assessed, he decided, he acted. What he assessed was that the Soviet crew was in the lifeboats and would survive. What he decided was that the cargo had not all made it into those lifeboats, which meant some portion of it was still attached to a vessel descending toward the floor of the North Pacific, and that before it got there, he was going to know what it was. He surfaced the Beaumont. What happened next occupied about 40 pages of Raymond's personal documentation, including his own handwritten account and the accounts he'd collected from the two other men who were present. Nora read them, standing at the tailgate of the Tacoma, while Raymond stood beside her, and added context where the written record didn't carry enough weight on its own. The Beaumont surfaced at distance, crew confined below, only Ashworth and a three-man recovery team on the deck. The Palzanov's stern was still partially above water, the final section taking longer to go under than the bow had. In that window, attached to cleats on the aft deck by ropes that the departing crew had cut rather than untied, were 4 metal containers that had not made it into the lifeboats. The containers were standard Soviet military transit cases, the kind used for transporting sensitive equipment across long distances, built to resist water and impact. They were floating. Barely, but floating. Ashworth's team retrieved them with a grappling line and a winch. 31 minutes of work in the dark in the North Pacific, while the Soviet lifeboats rowed away toward a signal that the Beaumont's communications team would subsequently relay through channels that kept the rescue anonymous. All 4 cases came aboard. The Palzanov went under. The lifeboats were eventually recovered by a Japanese Coast Guard vessel. The crew's accounts of what had happened to their ship duly recorded and filed, and subsequently accepted at face value by an international community that had no reason to look more closely. The 4 cases contained 211.75 kilograms of gold. Specifically, 847 bars of approximately 150 troy ounces each, Soviet standard dimensions and purity, bearing assay stamps from a state mint in the Ural region and a production date of 1968. Gold that had been in the Soviet government's possession for 14 years before someone decided to move it across the Pacific in the hold of a research vessel under civilian registry. Gold that should have been, by any standard application of international law, the property of the Soviet government. Gold that was instead, as of April 14, 1982, in the torpedo bay of an American submarine that had never officially been anywhere near the location where it was recovered. Ashworth logged none of this. He filed his standard patrol report covering the surveillance activities that were the Beaumont's official purpose on this deployment. He noted in the official log that they had monitored Soviet communications activity consistent with a maritime emergency, but had not been positioned to intervene. He made no reference to the Palzanov by name, no reference to the recovery, no reference to 4 cases now stored in a compartment of the forward torpedo room behind a standard access panel, that his engineering team had quietly reinforced over the course of the following 3 days. He sent one private message through a personal channel to a contact in Washington whose name Raymond would not share even now, and received back a reply that Raymond summarized for Nora in 3 words: handle it quietly. Ashworth spent the remaining 11 months of that deployment deciding what quietly meant. Raymond closed the folder and replaced it carefully in its plastic sleeve. He told us when we were back in port, Raymond said. Not the full crew, just the 3 of us. Lutter and Greer and me. He explained what had happened and what was in the cases and what the instruction from Washington had been, and then he told us what he decided to do about it, which was nothing for the time being. Hold it. Wait to see what the political situation looked like in 6 months, in a year. Wait to see whether whoever had sent him that message from Washington was going to follow up, or whether they were going to let it disappear into the same silence that swallowed most of what happened in that ocean during those years. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the documentation spread across the tailgate. We held our peace for 4 years. Ashworth retired in '86. By that point, he'd concluded that the Washington contact was never going to follow up, that the message had been sent by someone who'd since changed positions or retired or died, that the chain of accountability for what was sitting in that compartment had simply dissolved. And he'd concluded something else, which he shared with the 3 of us when he called us back to Bangor in March of '87. Nora waited. He'd spent 4 years reading about where gold like this went when governments got their hands on it. Reading about asset forfeiture proceedings and classified recovery programs, and the history of recovered wartime gold, the Nazi gold cases, the various court battles that went on for decades and never resolved in any way that put money in the hands of anyone who'd actually been harmed. His conclusion was that if the U.S. government took official possession of what was in that compartment, it would enter a process that would take 30 years and end with the gold sitting in a federal vault somewhere, categorized as a foreign government asset under interagency dispute accessible to no one. He said that was the most charitable version. The less charitable version was that it would simply be absorbed quietly into an off-books account and used for purposes that would never be publicly disclosed. Raymond looked at Nora directly. He thought about who the gold should go to if it was going to go somewhere useful. The Soviet government was the legal owner, but the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, and the successor states had their own relationships with their Soviet-era assets that didn't suggest an obvious path to justice. The gold hadn't been stolen from civilians. It hadn't been looted from a museum or taken from population. It was state gold, moved for state purposes, lost in a state operation. There was no obvious victim to make whole. He paused. What he settled on was the idea that the right answer was to leave it somewhere secure until someone figured out the right use for it, until the moment was clearer, until someone who wasn't part of any institution could make a decision about it without being constrained by institutional interests. He looked at her. He thought about that for 5 years. He came back and helped us install that hatch and seal it, and then he died 7 years later, and he never got to see what came next. Because nothing came next. Not for 36 years. The cold was steady, and the morning traffic had started on the blocks beyond the lot, and the world was going about its ordinary business in every direction. Nora stood at the tailgate and looked at the documentation that Raymond had spent 3.5 decades maintaining and thought about Commander David Ashworth making a decision in the dark in the North Pacific. 31 minutes of work in April of 1982, and then carrying that decision in silence for 14 more years until it killed him. What happened to the Polzanov crew? She asked. They were rescued. 41 men, all accounted for. The Soviet government's official explanation was a structural failure in the hull, which may have been true as far as it went. They never publicly acknowledged what the Polzanov was carrying. If they suspected American involvement in the cargo's disappearance, they had no way to prove it and significant reasons not to pursue it officially. The vessel was in international waters. The Cold War had its own calculus about what got pursued and what got quietly buried, and this apparently fell into the latter category. Nora put the last folder back in a box. She looked at Raymond. And now, he said, I have a pipe wrench and a breaker bar in that tool bag, and I've been waiting for 36 years for someone to ask that question. He picked up the tool bag and looked at her. You ready? She picked up her soup can and her coffee and her backpack, and she thought about the gap in the fence and the wheel that had moved under her hands and a fern leaf pressed between the pages of a logbook by someone who'd wanted to leave something human inside a record of facts. She thought about 41 names on a shelter wait list. She thought about $6.43 and a sleeping bag that wasn't enough. Then she stopped thinking about those things and thought instead about the hatch and what was behind it and what it meant for a thing to wait 36 years for the right person to come along. Yeah, she said, I'm ready. They went back through the fence gap in single file, Raymond moving more easily than his cane suggested he would, adapting to the terrain without complaint, and crossed the concrete lot to the Beaumont's dry dock with the tool bag and the storage box, and the particular silence of two people who had agreed on something significant and were now in the process of doing it. Raymond knew the boat. He moved through the conning tower, hatch ahead of her, and down through the compartments without hesitation. The headlamp he'd taken from his tool bag cutting a clean beam through the dark. He passed through the control room and the crew quarters and the hatches between compartments with the ease of someone navigating a space their body remembered even after decades of absence. He paused once in the middle of the crew quarters and put his hand flat against the curved wall without saying anything, and then took it away and kept walking. He paused in the control room and stood in front of the compass pedestal, his headlamp on the compass itself, the heading frozen where it had been when the Beaumont last moved through water under her own power. He didn't speak. She didn't ask him to. Some things between people who had shared a space were communicated better without words, and she'd learned this well enough in the past 3 weeks with the Beaumont herself. The way the boat communicated through its atmosphere and its silences in ways that didn't require language. The night we came back in '87, Raymond said, still looking at the compass, after we'd installed the hatch and sealed everything up and signed off on the work order as routine maintenance. I stood right here for about 10 minutes. I don't know what I was thinking exactly. I was 29 years old, and I'd just done something that was either the most important thing I'd ever do or the most foolish, and I couldn't tell which. Ashworth shook my hand before he left the boat for the last time. Told me that honest men sometimes had to make choices that the rule book didn't cover, and that the best way to evaluate a choice like that was to ask yourself whether you could explain it to someone who had no stake in the answer, someone with nothing to gain from agreeing with you. He turned away from the compass. I've been telling myself the story of that choice for 36 years, try to explain it to the imaginary person with nothing to gain. I think I've finally found her. They went through the remaining hatches to the forward torpedo room. In the forward torpedo room, he set the tool bag down and turned his headlamp directly on the sealed hatch. He stood in front of it for a long moment, not speaking, not moving, just looking at the wheel and the frame and the bolts he'd driven himself 36 years ago. Then he reached into the tool bag and produced a 48-inch pipe wrench with a head on it that could have gripped a section of sewer main and a 2-foot section of steel pipe that served as a cheater bar for additional leverage. The wheel is going to resist, he said. The preservation compound I used was petroleum-based, which means it shouldn't have fully polymerized, but the mechanical resistance after this long is going to be significant. We're going to need to apply steady force rather than sudden force. Sudden force is how you strip threads or break the wheel off the mechanism. And if that happens, we're looking at a much more complicated extraction. He fitted the pipe wrench to the wheel and checked his grip. The wrench head engaged 4 of the 8 spokes cleanly. He adjusted the set, checked it again, then fitted the cheater bar over the wrench handle for additional leverage. On my signal, he said, I want you to brace against the starboard bulkhead and push on my back with both hands. Add your force to mine in a steady, sustained push. Consistent pressure. Don't let up until I tell you. Nora took her position, both palms flat against Raymond's shoulder blades, feet planted on the deck plates with her weight forward. Now, he said. She felt the resistance in her hands and her shoulders and finally all the way in her back. The full chain of force transmitted from Raymond's arms through his body, through her palms, through her own frame, and understood in a physical way that she hadn't fully understood intellectually that this was real, this was happening. The thing she'd been looking at for 3 weeks through the lens of possibility was converting into fact under the pressure of 2 people who had both arrived at the same conclusion from entirely different directions. Raymond worked with the systematic patience of someone who'd thought about this problem from many angles and settled on the right approach. He didn't rush. He applied force in measured increments, released, reapplied, reading the mechanism the way you read a lock you're picking, listening for the information contained in the resistance rather than fighting it. Every few minutes he'd adjust the position of the wrench head, gain a fresh purchase on the wheel, and they'd begin again. She thought, standing there pushing against his back with both hands, about what it meant that he'd kept the tools. Not just the documentation, but the actual physical tools for the job, a pipe wrench large enough for this specific mechanism, a breaker bar of the right length, carried in that truck for who knew how many years against the day he'd need them. That was not the behavior of someone who'd given up. That was the behavior of someone who'd never stopped preparing for a specific outcome, who'd been holding the tools ready for 36 years, waiting for the person who would come through the fence and ask the question he'd been waiting to answer. They pushed. The first 10 seconds produced nothing. Just the sound of 2 people breathing and the faint creak of the tool bag shifting on the deck and the absolute still of the submarine around them. Then, very faintly, the sound she'd heard before but amplified now, that low groan from inside the wheel housing, metal against metal, something that had been motionless for 36 years being asked to become otherwise. "Oh," Raymond said. "Hold steady." The groan deepened. A second sound joined it, a dry, fibrous tearing that she couldn't identify until she realized it was the preservation compound breaking its seal, the coating she'd felt with her thumbnail finally giving way under sustained force. The wheel turned. Not much, not yet, but it turned, and the difference between not moving and moving was the difference between locked and possible, and once it was possible, the rest was just work. Again, Raymond said. Same pressure. Don't rush it. They worked in cycles, pressing until the mechanism moved a fraction, releasing, pressing again, the wheel turning by degrees around the clock face of the hatch. 1 hour, then a second, then a third. Her back was aching from the sustained posture, and her arms had started to shake by the time Raymond said, quietly, "That's it." She stepped back. He removed the pipe wrench and set it carefully on the deck. He put both hands on the wheel and turned at the final quarter rotation with nothing but his own strength. The mechanism now moving freely, the internal locking bars retracting in sequence, and the hatch swung open on hinges that had been waiting 36 years for permission to move. The smell hit them first. Not rot, not decay, not the organic reek she might have expected from sealed space. Something mineral and cold, the smell of compressed air that had not moved in decades, flat and metallic and weirdly clean, as if whatever had been sealed in here had been preserved against change with the same deliberateness that had gone into sealing the hatch. Raymond shone his headlamp through the opening. The beam reached about 12 feet and hit a wall of darkness that the light couldn't fully penetrate. He reached into his tool bag and produced a second lamp, this one a broad beam lantern rather than a focused headlamp, and handed it to Nora. Then he stepped through the hatch. She followed. The space on the other side was not a standard compartment. She'd looked at enough of the Beaumont's interior over the past 3 weeks to understand what standard meant on this vessel, and this was not it. It was smaller than any of the other compartments, roughly 8 feet by 12, with a low ceiling that required both of them to duck slightly in walls that had been lined, not with the bare steel of the rest of the boat, but with wooden crating material, thick planks that had been fitted against the bulkheads and fastened in place, a layer of insulation between the metal and whatever was being stored here. The floor had the same treatment, wood over metal, worn smooth and slightly bowed in places from the weight it had supported for 3.5 decades. And on the floor, stacked in rows of 3 and arranged in 4 columns along each wall, were the crates. They were wooden, the same kind of plain transit crating that Raymond had described from the Soviet cases, though the original Soviet cases themselves had clearly been broken down and repacked at some point during the transfer to the Beaumont. The contents repackaged in unmarked boxes of American construction, the kind of anonymous crating you could source from any naval supply depot. Each crate was approximately 2 feet by 18 inches by 8 inches deep, sealed with standard hardware clasps, unlabeled. There were 8 of them. She counted twice to be sure. 8 crates, 2 feet by 18 inches, and she already knew from Raymond's documentation what was inside them. But knowing a thing is information and standing in a room with it were 2 entirely different experiences, and the difference was doing something to the air she was breathing, making it seem thicker or lighter or in some way different from the air in the rest of the submarine. Raymond crouched beside the nearest crate and worked the clasps with hands that she noticed were not shaking, which told her something about the kind of person he was, the kind of steadiness that came from having lived with the weight of a thing for long enough that the thing itself no longer surprised you. The clasps released. He lifted the lid. Gold caught the light of her lantern the way gold does, which is to say it caught it completely and gave almost none of it back, the deep amber color that gold produces in dim light, row after row of bars stacked in cotton padding, each bar roughly the size of a thick hardcover book, bearing the faint markings of their assay stamps and the particular quality of aged metal that had been kept in the dark and the cold for more than 3 decades without being touched or moved or acknowledged by any human hand. She opened a second crate at random, identical to the first. 24 bars in 4 layers, each bar approximately the size she'd estimated, each bearing the same assay stamps, each surrounded by the same cotton padding that had preserved them across 36 years of dark and cold and total stillness. She reached into the crate and picked up one of the bars and felt the weight of it shift in her hands, that particular density of gold that was different from the density of any other metal, heavier per volume than almost anything you'd ever hold. The mass of a thing concentrated. She'd read once that gold was so dense you could fit all the gold ever mined in history into a cube 60 feet on each side. This bar in her hands was a small fraction of all of that, and it weighed enough that holding it with one hand was awkward. She put it back carefully. She thought about Commander David Ashworth surfacing the Beaumont at 0340 hours on April 14, 1982, in the dark in the North Pacific, and getting the cases aboard in 31 minutes, and then logging none of it, and then spending 14 years carrying the weight of a choice that had left him with something he couldn't give back and couldn't use and couldn't in good conscience hand over to the people who would have made it disappear. She thought about what it cost to carry something like that, what it cost day by day across 14 years, the accumulated weight of a secret that served no one while it was kept and might serve everyone if it was released correctly. She thought about Ashworth at his desk with a manual typewriter, working through the problem one page at a time, building a record for someone he could not identify and would not live to meet. She understood, standing there, something she hadn't fully articulated to herself before, that the gold was not the point. It had never been the point. The point was the record. The point was Ashworth's 3 years of documentation and the letter in her pocket and the deliberate, careful, meticulous act of a man trying to make sure that what he'd done would eventually mean something to someone who deserved it to mean something. The gold was just the thing that made the record worth preserving. She counted the bars in the crate. 24. 8 crates. 24 bars per crate. That was 192 bars per layer, but the crates were layered for bars deep in each crate. 8 crates times 4 layers times 24 bars. She stopped doing the arithmetic before she reached the end of it. Raymond had already done it for her. 847 bars. 150 troy ounces per bar. She'd looked up the current spot price at the library 3 days ago, after she'd started taking the whole thing seriously, and the number she'd seen was just above $3,000 per troy ounce. She did the final multiplication in her head while standing in the sealed forward compartment of a decommissioned submarine in a locked museum lot in Bremerton, Washington, with $6.43 in her coat pocket and her name 41st on a shelter wait list. $385 million. Give or take. Raymond let her stand there for a long moment without saying anything. He'd straightened up from the crate and was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his headlamp aimed at the floor rather than at her face, giving her the privacy of her own processing time in the way of someone who understood that certain information needed to arrive at its own pace. When she finally turned to look at him, he nodded once. "Bigger than you expected?" he said. "I calculated it in my head on the way over," she said. "It was different when it was in my head. It always is." He pushed off the wall and moved to the far end of the compartment, where she noticed for the first time that there was something else. Behind the last column of crates, partially obscured until you came around them, was a metal case of different construction than the wooden crates, roughly the size and shape of a large briefcase, made of aircraft-grade aluminum with a pressure seal and 2 combination locks. It had clearly been placed here at the same time as everything else, treated with the same care, the seals maintained with the same preservation compound. Raymond crouched beside it. "Ashworth put this here himself," he said. "Not as part of the original recovery. He put this here during the Bangor maintenance period when we came back to install the hatch. He had 3 years of notes in here, documentation he'd assembled after the recovery, research into the Polzanov and her cargo history. He wanted whoever opened this compartment to understand what they were looking at before they did anything with it." "Do you know the combination?" "I do." He worked the locks with practiced efficiency. Both combinations entered without hesitation and opened the case. Inside, in archival quality document sleeves that had done their job across 3.5 decades, were perhaps 200 pages of documentation, typed on a manual typewriter, mostly in the compact single-space format of someone who understood they were working against a limited supply of paper. Photographs, printed on paper that had yellowed at the edges but remained legible, showing the deck of a vessel she didn't recognize, dark water, men in cold-weather gear working around crates in the dark, a face she didn't recognize but which Raymond identified as Ashworth, younger by 20 years than any photograph she'd be able to find publicly, standing at the periscope mount of a submarine with an expression that was not triumphant and not afraid, but something in between. There were charts. navigational charts of the North Pacific with a route marked in pencil, a position circled, coordinates noted in the margin in Ashworth's handwriting. There were 3 pages of a translation, handwritten, for what the header identified as Cyrillic text, the documents having been translated by Ashworth himself from a manifest he'd found inside the Soviet cases. The manifest indicated the gold's origin, a state reserve account at a facility in the Sverdlovsk region, designated for transfer to an intelligence asset network operating in the Pacific Rim. The network's identifying codes were listed. The intended recipient, identified only by a 4-letter code, appeared never to have received what was meant for them. Nora read through the translated manifest slowly, standing in the sealed compartment, her lantern casting a broad circle of light across the documentation that Ashworth had spent 3 years assembling before sealing it with the gold, before dying 7 years after that without telling anyone but 3 sailors what he'd done. She thought about a man in his 50s, sitting at a desk somewhere with a manual typewriter, working through the implications of a decision he'd made in 30 seconds in the dark in the North Pacific, building a record for someone he'd never meet, writing notes for a future he couldn't see. She thought about the fern leaf in the logbook, about the engineering officer who'd left something beautiful inside a record of facts. She thought about 36 years of a sealed compartment and a locked hatch and a man with a key ring who'd been watching this lot, waiting for the right person to come through the fence. "What happens now?" she said. Raymond looked at her. "Now you decide," he said. "Not me. You. I've been waiting for someone to open that hatch who was in a position to make this decision honestly, without institutional pressure and without personal interest in burying it. You've got nothing to protect and nothing to hide and nothing to gain from keeping this quiet." That's the profile Ashworth was writing toward. He paused. "So I'm asking you, what do we do with $385 million in gold and a classified Navy operation that the government of the United States has never officially acknowledged?" She stood in the cold, dim compartment with a lantern light on the gold and the documentation spread across the aluminum case and the absolute quiet of the Beaumont around them. And she understood that this was the question she'd been walking toward since the night she'd come through the fence. Maybe longer than that. Maybe since August, when she'd walked out of the system with a garbage bag and a number that was supposed to be the start of something. She was 19 years old, and she had $6.43, and she was standing in front of the answer to a question the world had been asking for 36 years without knowing it was asking. "I think we need a lawyer," she said, "and I think we need to be very careful about which lawyer." They stayed in the compartment for another hour, going through the documentation, Raymond explaining context where the written record needed it. He'd spent 36 years with this material and could move through it the way you move through a house you'd lived in for a long time, knowing which rooms held what before you opened the doors. The Polzanov, he explained, had been part of a pattern. 3 Soviet vessels had gone down in the North Pacific over a period of 4 years in the late 70s and early 80s, each one on a route that didn't match its official mission, each one carrying cargo that wasn't on the manifest, each one recovered by American assets operating in international waters under cover of routine surveillance patrols. The other 2 recoveries had gone through proper channels. Their cargoes had been logged, reported, processed through the appropriate interagency procedures. Both had subsequently disappeared into the classified asset pool, which is to say both had become line items in budgets that nobody was going to read about. The Polzanov was the third. Ashworth's documentation suggested he'd known about the other 2, had watched what happened to them, had drawn his own conclusions about whether proper channels led to proper outcomes when the asset in question was valuable enough to be worth fighting over institutionally. He made a different choice. "The legal situation is complicated," Raymond said, sitting on the edge of one of the crates with his cane across his knees. "The gold doesn't fit cleanly into any existing category of law. It's not U.S. government property because it was never officially reported or logged. It's not Soviet or Russian government property in any practically actionable sense because the entity that owned it no longer exists and the circumstances of its loss were never formally acknowledged. It was in international waters when it was recovered. There's a reasonable argument, under maritime salvage law, that the party who recovered it has a claim. The party who recovered it was the U.S. Navy. acting unofficially on the personal order of one officer in an action that was never logged. The Navy has no official knowledge of this recovery. They can't assert a claim based on an action that doesn't exist in their records. He looked at her steadily. There's a different argument that's been worked out by a lawyer I consulted anonymously about 8 years ago. The argument is that if the party who recovered the asset and sealed it chose to convey it to a subsequent finder through deliberate acts of preservation and documentation, the subsequent finder has a salvage claim that's defensible. Nora looked at him. Ashworth conveyed it to whoever opened that hatch. Ashworth conveyed it to whoever opened that hatch. That's what the documentation in this case is designed to establish. He was meticulous about it. Dates, circumstances, chain of custody from the point of recovery through the point of deliberate sealing. He made a gift, in the legal sense of the word, to an unknown future party. Raymond paused. The lawyer I consulted said the legal theory was sound, but that the practical challenge was going to be the assertion of U.S. government interest once the discovery became public. Because it would become public. There's no version of this that doesn't become public. And when it does, you're going to need someone who can make the case that this gold belongs to the world rather than to a government, and that the right use of it is something Ashworth's documentation explicitly addressed. He reached into the aluminum case and produced a single sheet, the last page of the file, typed on the same manual typewriter as everything else. He wrote a letter to whoever opened the hatch. He wrote it in 1993, 2 years before he died. I think you should read it. She took the page and angled it toward her lantern. The letter was addressed to no one by name. It began, "By the time you read this, I'll have been dead long enough that the political situation has changed in ways I can't predict. What I can predict is that the gold is still there because I built the seal to last, and that whoever is reading this had enough curiosity and enough determination to open something that everyone else walked past." She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her jacket pocket, which was not the archival sleeve it had been in, but she needed it closer than a metal case. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Raymond said. "We still have to figure out how to get out of here without being seen." He said this without apparent concern, matter-of-factly, the way you'd say it if you'd spent 36 years thinking about contingency logistics. But something in the word scene made Nora look at him more carefully. "Were you followed here?" she asked. "I don't think so. But I've been on this foundation board for 11 years, and the lot comes up regularly in county meetings about property disposal. There's a county counselor who's been pushing hard for the scrap option for 2 years, and I've blocked it twice through procedural challenges, and both times within a week of the council meeting, I've found a vehicle parked near my house that wasn't from the neighborhood." He paused. Maybe coincidence. Maybe not. Small towns talk. I've been very careful about what I've said to who, but careful isn't the same as invisible. She thought about this, about a county counselor pushing for scrap, about vehicles parked near Raymond's house, about a foundation board with 4 members and no money, a lot that hadn't been checked on since 2019, and an old man in a veteran's cap who had managed for 11 years to keep the Beaumont from being turned into scrap metal through a series of procedural challenges that now, in context, look considerably less like bureaucratic persistence and considerably more like deliberate protection. He'd been protecting the boat. He'd been protecting what was in it. For 11 years, alone. She was about to say something when Raymond put his hand up, a quick gesture, instinctive, the kind that meant listen. She listened. From somewhere above them, from the direction of the museum lot, came the sound of a vehicle. Not passing traffic, not the ordinary ambient noise of a city block going about its morning. A vehicle that had slowed, that had stopped, that was idling. Raymond looked at her, his expression neither panicked nor unworried. The look of someone who had thought through this scenario and had arrived at a plan some time ago and was now in the process of implementing it. "We don't move yet," he said, very quietly. "We wait and see what they do. If they were just passing, they'll move on. If they weren't just passing, we have options." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small notebook. "I have a phone number for a journalist in Seattle who's been working on Cold War asset recovery stories for 4 years. I've been cultivating her as a contact for 18 months without telling her why. If we need to move quickly, going public is the fastest protection we have." He looked at Nora. "This isn't the first time a vehicle has parked outside a property I'm connected to. It's the first time it's happened when the hatch was open." Outside, the idling continued. Then, very clearly, the sound of a door opening. Then footsteps on concrete, slow and deliberate, heading toward the dry dock. Nora looked at Raymond, and Raymond looked at Nora, and the sealed compartment with its $385 million in gold bars and its 36-year-old letter from a dead commander sat around them in the dark, patient as it had always been patient, waiting to see what came next. She thought about the gap in the fence, and the hatch that opened, and the wheel that moved under her hands. She thought about everything that had led here. August, and the exit package, and the ferry, and the lot, and the cold, and the decision to stay. She thought about what it meant to have nothing left to lose. Then she thought about the footsteps on the concrete getting closer, and decided this was not a moment for thinking. It was a moment for moving. She thought about going public, and what that meant practically. A journalist. A story published and verifiable, existing outside this sealed compartment, outside the aluminum case, outside the two of them in a locked lot in a town going about its ordinary November morning, without any idea what sat in the dry dock at the far end of the waterfront. The record, once it existed somewhere beyond this space, couldn't be unsealed. You couldn't unknown information that a credible outlet had published, couldn't make $385 million in documented, photographed, independently verified gold bars disappear once the photographs were somewhere other than a storage box in the bed of a 15-year-old Tacoma. The most dangerous moment was right now, before the record existed anywhere but here. She understood this the way she understood practical things. Not abstractly, but in the body, the calculation that ran through her chest when she assessed a situation and determined what it was asking of her. Speed with intention. The difference between that and panic was the difference between running towards something and running from it, and she'd spent too many months running from things to confuse the two directions now. "The journalist," she said. "What's her name?" Raymond reached into his jacket pocket and produced a business card, heavier stock than modern cards, the kind handed out at conferences and kept because instincts said it would matter someday. "Claire Donahue. Seattle Times, 12 years. Careful and thorough. Hasn't burned a source. We call her from the aft dock after we're out." "That's what I was going to suggest," Raymond said. She moved to the forward hatch and looked through it toward the torpedo room, listening. The footsteps outside had stopped. Stop was ambiguous. It meant either whoever was there had moved on, or whoever was there was now being still, and those possibilities required different responses. She filed the ambiguity and focused on what she could control. They could hear nothing specific. The Beaumont steel hull absorbed sound from outside and produced its own particular quality of silence in exchange, the silence of an enclosed metal space that had been keeping its own counsel for 36 years and was accustomed to the work. Raymond came to the hatch beside her, the aluminum case in both hands, headlamp angled to keep the light from reaching toward the conning tower. He'd thought about this. He'd thought about most of it, probably. 36 years was a long time to plan for contingencies. "Aft escape trunk," he said. "Hull between us and the lot entrance. We surface on the dock side. We walk to the truck, and we drive to the library, which is 4 blocks away and has a parking lot and a lobby we can stand in while we make calls." He paused. "I have a prepaid phone in the truck, not connected to me, for this specific purpose." She looked at him for a second. "You've been ready for this?" "For a while," he said. "How long?" He picked up the case and started moving toward the aft compartments. "Come on," he said. "We can talk about that later." She picked up her backpack and followed, moving through the Beaumont's hatches with the ease of 3 weeks of practice, ducking and rotating through each opening without having to think about it. The geometry in her body now. The submarine guided her toward its aft in the way it had guided her every day for the past 3 weeks, patient and solid and familiar. Whatever was waiting on the concrete above them, she was going to meet it. She had been waiting her entire life to be the person who walked through the door rather than the one who stood outside it. She was done waiting. The aft escape trunk opened onto the dock side of the dry dock, a narrow concrete ledge between the Beaumont's hull and the retaining wall, invisible from the main lot entrance and sheltered by the angle of the vessel herself. They came through one at a time, Raymond first with the aluminum case, then Nora, pulling the trunk hatch shut behind her. She stood on the ledge with her back against the hull and listened. Footsteps, still on concrete, coming from the direction of the forward dry dock area. A single set, unhurried, then a voice, male, talking into a phone. She caught fragments. Survey, county lot, pending disposition, next meeting. The particular flat cadence of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than making a discovery. Not urgency. Administration. Raymond was watching her face. She shook her head slightly, and he relaxed in a way that wasn't dramatic but was visible, the small release of a very controlled person allowing themselves a fraction of relief. They waited 4 minutes on the concrete ledge, pressed against the Beaumont's hull in the November cold, not speaking. The footsteps made a circuit of the lot, paused at the dry dock area long enough that she held her breath, then moved away toward the fence line and the sound of a car door and an engine starting. The vehicle pulled out and the lot went quiet again. Raymond looked at her. "County inspector," he said. "They do property status checks every few months. I've been intercepting the reports for 2 years by staying on the board. I knew one was due." He paused. "I didn't know it would be today. But you were ready anyway," she said. "I've been ready for 11 years, he said. "The only thing I wasn't ready for was you." She didn't know exactly what he meant by that and didn't ask, because the moment required moving rather than talking. They went back through the fence gap, Raymond managing it with the aluminum case and the cane in a way that required a brief redistribution of what he was carrying, and walked the 2 blocks to his truck in the thin November morning. Both of them carrying the weight of what they'd left behind in the sealed compartment, and what they were carrying in the case, and what was folded in Nora's jacket pocket, the letter from the dead commander. 2 pages of manual typewriter text from 1993, addressed to no one and written for everyone. Raymond unlocked the truck, and they sat in the cab with the engine running for the heat, and he reached under the seat and produced a prepaid phone still in its blister packaging. He broke it open and activated it without ceremony and handed it to Nora along with a business card. "You should make the call," he said. "Not me. You're the one who found it." She looked at the card. Claire Donahue, Seattle Times, Investigations. A phone number, a direct line. The walk from the aft escape trunk to Raymond's truck took 11 minutes because they went 3 blocks out of the way rather than 2 blocks direct, passing through the parking area behind the hardware store and across the back of the laundromat lot, avoiding the street that ran along the museum lot's east edge. Raymond didn't explain this route. He'd clearly thought about it before. She matched his pace without commenting and filed the route the same way she'd filed everything he did, as deliberate, as planned, as the behavior of someone who had spent a very long time preparing for a moment and was now executing the preparation with the quiet precision of someone who had rehearsed it. In the truck, she read Ashworth's letter all the way through for the first time. She'd read the final lines standing in the compartment, but now with heat coming through the vents and Raymond beside her looking at the steering wheel, she read it from the beginning. Ashworth had written it on a day in January 1993. His handwriting was dense and even, the typewriter keys striking with uniform pressure across every line. He wrote as a man who understood he was writing to an unknown future reader, which gave the document an unusual quality, a kind of clarity that came from the absence of a specific audience. No need to perform, no need to persuade. He was simply explaining himself to whoever was willing to understand. He'd written about the Polzanoff, about the 31 minutes in the dark, about the calculation he'd made in those seconds when the vessel was going down and the cases were floating and nobody on Earth was watching except the crew of a submarine that wasn't supposed to be there. He wrote about what he'd thought at the time, which was not that he was making history, not that he was doing something important or brave or complicated, but simply that the cases were there and they would sink in approximately 4 minutes, and they could come aboard or they couldn't, and in 4 minutes it would be one thing or the other. He'd written about the 5 years after, about the weight of it, about carrying a thing that had no proper home and refusing to give it to an institution that would make it disappear because that felt, to him, like a second wrong to answer the original one. About the lawyer he'd quietly consulted in 1985, a friend from his Naval Academy days who'd gone into maritime law and who'd been professionally horrified by Ashworth's situation and personally fascinated by it, and who had spent 8 months working out the conveyance theory that had eventually been the foundation of the legal case, decades later, without either of them knowing it. He wrote, "I don't know if what I've done is right in the strict sense. I know that it is not wrong in the sense that matters, which is to say I have not enriched myself, have not hidden this for private use, have not denied anyone a claim they could properly assert. I have held something in trust for a future I cannot predict. The risk is that the future doesn't come. The alternative was certainty of a worse outcome. I will accept the risk." She folded the letter back along its original creases and held it in her lap. The coffee she'd been carrying since Pete's was cold now. She drank it anyway. "He was a good writer," she said. "He was a precise thinker," Raymond said. The writing followed from that. She sat in the warm cab with the heater running and the gray Bremerton morning outside the windows and thought for a moment about what she was about to do, not with doubt, but with the particular attention she gave to moments before she committed to them. Then she dialed. The phone rang twice. "Donahue," said the voice on the other end. Sharp. Present. The voice of someone who answered her phone the same way at 7 in the morning as she did at 3 in the afternoon. "My name is Nora Hayes," Nora said. "I'm calling for Bremerton. I think you've been working on a story that I have the other half of." Claire Donahue arrived the following morning in a rental car that she'd driven from Seattle before 6, beating the ferry traffic and the Tacoma Narrows slowdown, and arriving in Bremerton with 2 hours to spare before the time Nora had suggested. She was 41, brown-haired, wearing the practical field clothes of someone who went places to find things rather than waiting for things to be brought to her. She had a camera bag over one shoulder and a laptop under her arm, and the assessing eyes of someone who'd been told extraordinary things before and had learned that the distance between extraordinary and true was not always as large as it seemed and not always as small as you hoped. She'd been professionally skeptical on the phone. That was fine. Professional skepticism from a competent journalist was exactly what this situation required, and Nora had said as much to her when she called, which she suspected was part of why Claire had made the drive. They met at the coffee shop because Nora was not going to introduce a journalist to the Beaumont in a parking lot without first sitting down and talking. Pete gave them the corner table without being asked and refilled Nora's coffee and left them alone with the instinct of someone who'd seen enough of the world in a small coffee shop to know when a conversation needed privacy. Raymond laid the aluminum case on the table and opened it, and Claire Donahue went through the documentation for 2 hours without asking anything that wasn't necessary, which was the mark of someone who understood that the first reading was for comprehension, not interrogation. She read Ashworth's operational notes. She read Raymond's personal journals. She examined the translated Soviet manifest, going through it twice with a legal pad she'd produced from her bag and making notes in the compressed shorthand Nora associated with people who'd been trained to record things fast. She examined the photographs of the recovery, the deck of the Beaumont in the dark, the cases being grappled aboard, Ashworth's face in the dim light of the periscope mount. Then she read the letter. She set it down and looked at Raymond for a long moment. "How long have you been waiting to show this to someone?" she said. 11 years on the foundation board, Raymond said, "but I've been carrying it longer than that. And before me, nobody—" "Before her," Raymond said, and he nodded at Nora. "Nobody." Claire looked at Nora with the particular attention of someone recalibrating their assessment of a situation. She was putting pieces together. Nora could see it happening, the journalist's specific skill of taking disparate elements and finding the shape they made when you held them at the right angle. "You're homeless," Claire said. "Not a question. Not unkind." "I was sleeping in the submarine," Nora said. "I've got 2 cleaning jobs now. And you found this while living in the torpedo room." "I found the hatch. Raymond found me." Claire looked at both of them for a moment, then at the case full of documentation, then at the coffee cup she'd been nursing for 2 hours without finishing. She put down her pen. "I'm going to need a photographer and a lawyer before we go any further. The photographer for the physical documentation. The lawyer because what you're describing is going to generate the kind of institutional response that will try to seize the physical evidence before any of it becomes public and the only way to prevent that is to make it public so fast they can't get ahead of it. She paused. I could have both here by this afternoon. Are you prepared to move at that speed? Yes, Raymond said. Yes, Nora said. Then I need to ask you one more thing, Claire said. She was looking at Nora specifically. Why you? I don't mean that dismissively. I mean it as a question I'm going to need to answer in print, because the story isn't just the gold. The story is who found it and why it was waiting for exactly that person. And if that answer isn't honest, the whole thing falls apart editorially. She paused. So, tell me honestly, why you? Nora thought about the gap in the fence, the hatch that opened on one pull, the wheel that moved. She thought about everything that had brought her to Bremerton in November with $6.43 and a sleeping bag that wasn't enough. She thought about Ashworth at his typewriter, writing a letter to someone with nothing to protect and nothing to hide, writing it to an idea of a person he'd never meet. Because I had nowhere else to go, she said. And that turned out to be the right qualification. Claire wrote that down. The photographer arrived from Seattle at noon, a man named Marcus who'd worked with Claire for 8 years and who treated the aluminum case and its contents with the careful reverence of someone who understood he was handling primary source material. He photographed every document in the case under controlled lighting conditions, photographed the technical drawings and the manifest translation and Ashworth's letter and every page of Raymond's 3 decades of personal journals. He produced a printed inventory as he worked, cataloging each item with the date stamp of the original document and the date of its photography. Claire was not the kind of journalist who accepted what she was told at face value, even from sources she trusted, and especially not from sources offering her the story of the century. She spent the first hour at the corner table not reading the documentation, but interrogating it, checking internal consistencies, comparing dates against publicly available records she was pulling on her laptop, asking Raymond questions that were designed to expose contradictions, if contradictions existed. They didn't exist. Raymond had spent 36 years making sure they didn't exist. She asked Nora questions too, and her questions were different from the ones she asked Raymond. She asked about the fence gap and the timing and the cleaning jobs and the shelter wait list. She asked about Frank Morrison and Dale and the maintenance manual. She asked about what Nora had thought she was looking for before she understood what she'd found. Nora answered everything honestly, including the parts that made her look careless or naive or simply lucky, because the truth of how she'd arrived here was not a story about skill. It was a story about circumstance and attention and the specific kind of determination that comes from having nothing to fall back on. Claire wrote all of it down. I'm going to ask you something that's going to sound like I'm doubting you, Claire said at one point. I'm not doubting you, but I need to know before I write this, whether you thought at any point that what you were doing was wrong. Legally wrong. Not just risky, but wrong. Nora thought about this. I thought about it, she said. I was sleeping in a space I didn't have permission to be in. That was trespassing. I was aware of it. What I was investigating didn't feel wrong because I wasn't taking anything. I was trying to understand something. The difference between trespass and theft is about what you carry out. And when Raymond told you what was there, I asked how to open the hatch, Nora said. I didn't ask how to take anything out of it. Claire looked at her for a moment. Then she wrote something on her legal pad and moved to the next question. At the end of the 2 hours, she closed her notebook and looked across the table at both of them. I want to be clear about something before we go any further, she said. I'm going to write this story regardless of what either of you decides. The documentation is real. The story is real. It's going to be told one way or another. What I can offer you is the ability to shape how it gets told, which means being on record on your terms before someone else puts you on record on theirs. She paused. Once this is public, the government is going to move fast. The only protection you have is that the story is already out there and the documentation is already in multiple hands. That's not my leverage over you. That's just the reality of the situation you're in. We know, Raymond said. Good, Claire said. Then let's talk about what happens this afternoon. Then they went to the Beaumont. The county inspector had been and gone. The lot was empty in the early afternoon. They went through the fence gap, 5 people strong. Nora, Raymond, Claire, Marcus the photographer, and a woman named Ellen Park, who Claire had reached by phone that morning, a maritime law attorney from a firm in Seattle that did salvage and international asset recovery work, and which apparently kept their principal partner's direct line available to journalists for exactly this category of situation. Ellen wore boots and a down jacket over what looked like a suit and carried a recorder and a tablet, and moved through the conning tower hatch with the composure of someone who descended into stranger spaces in pursuit of stranger cases. In the sealed compartment, Marcus worked for 40 minutes, photographing every crate from multiple angles, the bars visible through the open lid of the first crate, the dimensions of the space, the preservation materials, the installation details of the hatch itself from both sides. He documented the state of the preservation compound on the wheel, the bolt configuration, the oxidation patterns that established the timeline of the installation. He was working with the systematic thoroughness of someone building an evidentiary record rather than just a photographic one, and he and Ellen consulted briefly twice as he worked about what specific details the legal record would require. Ellen took her own measurements and her own photographs and made her own notes and said very little, which Nora found reassuring rather than concerning. Lawyers who talked a lot in unfamiliar situations were filling silence. Lawyers who measured and noted and said little were building something. They sealed the crate and closed the compartment door and left the hatch as it was, open, because Ellen had advised that the legal position was cleaner if the chain of possession was documented from the moment of opening rather than from second opening after the fact. She placed a physical seal on the hatch frame, a tamper-evident adhesive tab with a date and her firm's contact information, which was not legally binding in itself, but which created a documented record of the state of the compartment at a specific time, and which would matter if anyone subsequently claimed the compartment had been interfered with. Then they went back to the coffee shop because everything that was going to happen next was going to happen through phones and laptops and encrypted document transfers. And Pete's coffee shop had decent Wi-Fi and the kind of quiet that came from being a place people came to think rather than to be seen thinking. Claire filed the story at 6:47 that evening. Not the full story, not yet, but the opening, a documented first-person account of the discovery, the physical evidence, the chain of provenance established by Raymond's 36 years of documentation and Ashworth's letter and the translated Soviet manifest. Enough to establish the facts were real and the record was credible. Enough that the story existed outside the sealed compartment before anyone with institutional interest in keeping it sealed could act. It went live at midnight. By 7 the following morning, it had been read 2 million times. By noon, every major news outlet in the country had a reporter in Bremerton. The government's response arrived in the form of 2 men from the Department of Defense in suits that were too light for the Bremerton weather, accompanied by a lawyer from the Department of Justice who had driven up from Joint Base Lewis McChord and who carried the particular expression of someone who'd been given an assignment they hadn't had time to fully understand before being sent to execute it. They appeared at the museum lot on the morning of the second day, which was a full news cycle after Claire's story had established the public record, which meant they were arriving into a situation that was already documented, already distributed, and already being read by people whose job it was to watch for exactly this kind of government response. Ellen Park met them at the lot entrance with her tablet and her recorder already running. Raymond stood beside her with his cane and his key ring and the particular comma man who had spent 11 years on this foundation board specifically so that he would have standing to be present at this moment. Nora stood behind them both and said nothing, which Ellen had advised, because her legal position was delicate and silence was her friend until Ellen told her otherwise. The conversation that happened at the museum lot entrance on that Tuesday morning was not dramatic. The drama had already happened in April of 1982 and in March of 1987 and in the Torpedo room on a recent November morning when a wheel had turned for the first time in 36 years. What happened at the lot entrance was procedural, the government asserting its interest in an asset discovered on property in which it had a potential historical claim, and Ellen responding with a document she'd filed at 2 a.m. the previous night in a federal district court in Seattle. An emergency motion to preserve the asset in its current state pending a determination of ownership under the Abandoned Shipwreck Act, maritime salvage law, and the specific provisions of Commander Ashworth's documented conveyance. The DOJ lawyer read the filing on his phone. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would need to make some calls. Ellen told him to take his time. The injunction that followed was temporary and contested and produced a legal proceeding that occupied the next 11 months, which is a long time if you're living it day by day, and a short time for a case of this complexity. Nora did not attend all of the hearings. She attended the ones that mattered, sat in the gallery behind Ellen and the two additional attorneys who joined the case as its scope became clear, and listened to arguments that grew steadily further from the practical reality of a sealed compartment and a dead commander's letter and closer to the abstract language that large stakes produced in institutional settings. The legal proceedings generated their own momentum, which was different from the dramatic momentum of discovery and different from the slow, grinding momentum of waiting. It was the momentum of an institution processing something it hadn't been built to handle, generating paperwork the way a fire generated smoke, continuously and in volume, and without any clear relationship between the amount produced and the progress being made. Ellen Park was unimpressed by institutional momentum. She was the kind of lawyer who had chosen maritime law specifically because it operated at the intersection of history and commerce and international jurisdiction, where the rules were genuinely unclear and the cases turned on first principles rather than precedent, and who found the government's procedural strategies less intimidating than they were apparently intended to be. She filed responses with the same systematic efficiency with which she'd placed her tamper-evident seal on the hatch frame, accurately, completely, and in a way that established a clear record of every move made. Nora followed the proceedings closely during the first 3 months, and then less closely after that, when the pattern became clear and the daily variations were variations on the same several themes. She attended the hearings that Ellen flagged as significant and spent the intervening weeks finishing her independent living program paperwork, which she'd never fully completed the first time, and working on the admissions application for Tacoma Community College, and continuing her cleaning shifts at the motel and the coffee shop because the legal outcome was not yet certain, and because working was what she did and stopping felt like the wrong kind of anticipation. Pete gave her a small raise in December, unsolicited, in the form of a higher cash amount in the lockbox envelope, which he explained with the same brevity he'd explained the free first coffee. Brief statement, not repeated, move on. She thanked him, and he nodded, and they both went back to work. Dale at the coffee shop treated the proceedings with the ownership of someone who had been telling people about the Beaumont's incomplete cargo logs for years and had been waiting for the world to catch up. He was gracious about it, mostly, though he did tell Vera one morning while Nora was in earshot that he'd known all along something was unusual about that boat, and Vera had looked up from her half-eaten breakfast and said, "Dale, you said it might be nothing," and Dale had said, "I said it might be nothing, and it wasn't nothing." And Vera had gone back to her breakfast with the expression of someone recording a technical victory. Carla at the motel followed the proceedings with careful pragmatism and asked Nora once, without embarrassment, whether she was planning to stay on the overnight shifts. Nora said yes, for now, and Carla nodded and said she was glad to hear it, and refilled the coffee maker and went back to managing the operation with the brisk efficiency of someone who had not allowed a landmark legal case involving one of her overnight staff to disrupt the quality of Room 14's turnover. The hearing in which Raymond testified was in March, for months into the proceedings. Nora sat in the gallery and watched him answer 4 hours of questions with the patient precision of a man who had prepared for this specific conversation for 36 years and was not going to be rattled by it. The opposing counsel was competent and experienced and tried 3 different angles on Raymond's credibility, and Raymond answered each of them the same way. Directly, in complete sentences, with the specific dates and details that 3 decades of documentation had produced. He never hedged. He never qualified. He said what had happened, what he had done, why he had done it, and what he believed it meant. The judge asked him one question of her own at the end. She asked him whether he had ever considered coming forward earlier before the court proceedings and explaining what he knew to the appropriate authorities. Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, Your Honor, many times, and every time I considered it, I looked at what happened to the other 2 recoveries from that period, which are documented in the court record, and I decided that the appropriate authorities had already demonstrated what they would do with this information, which was to make it disappear. I was trying to find an alternative to that outcome. The judge wrote something on a notepad and said thank you. No further questions. 3 things turned the case. The first was Ashworth's letter, which the court admitted as a primary document establishing intent. The letter was explicit. Ashworth had taken deliberate steps to ensure the asset could be found and identified by a subsequent party, had prepared documentation for that party's use, and had structured the sealing of the compartment as an act of conveyance rather than abandonment. The legal distinction mattered enormously. Abandoned property was subject to one set of claims. Deliberately conveyed property was subject to another. Ashworth had understood this and had structured his actions accordingly. The second was the Navy's position, which turned out to be more complicated than either side expected. The Navy's own records contain no reference to the Beaumont's 1982 North Pacific operation as anything other than a standard surveillance patrol. They could not claim ownership of an asset that, according to their own records, they had never possessed. Asserting the claim would require them to acknowledge the operation, which would require them to explain the 36-year gap in their own records, which their legal team eventually concluded was not in the institution's interest to pursue. The third was Raymond Cho. He testified for 4 hours in the federal district court, and he was, by all accounts including the opposing counsel's, a devastating witness. Not because he was emotional, though the courtroom was not unmoved by the account of 3 men installing a hatch in a submarine at the end of their service lives on the instruction of a commander they respected and trusted. Not because his documentation was overwhelming, though it was, but because Raymond Cho had spent 36 years thinking about this case from every angle, had consulted a lawyer anonymously 8 years ago, had maintained the physical evidence with archival care, and had answered every question he was asked with the plain, unhesitating directness of someone who had long since made peace with every implication of what he was saying. When the opposing counsel suggested that his actions in 1987 had been unauthorized and self-serving, Raymond looked at him steadily and said, "I was a petty officer following the order of a commanding officer I trusted. The order was unusual. I understood it was unusual when I received it. I followed it because I had served with David Ashworth for 5 years, and I had never seen him make a decision that wasn't in the interest of the people he was responsible for. 36 years later, I still believe that." The courtroom was quiet for a moment after that. The judge was not demonstrative, but she was thorough, and her ruling, when it came 11 months after the proceedings began, ran to 94 pages and addressed every argument that had been raised, and its conclusion was unambiguous. The asset had been deliberately conveyed through Ashworth's documented acts. The finder's claim under maritime salvage law was valid, and the government's interest, while real, did not supersede the established chain of possession. The gold belonged, in law as it had in practice from the moment the hatch opened, to Nora Hayes and Raymond Cho. The number that appeared in Nora's bank account on a Tuesday morning in October was not $385 million. It was a negotiated settlement figure that accounted for a federal surcharge on recovered foreign government assets, legal fees, the cost of the independent valuation that the court had required, and the portion that Raymond had insisted on placing in a separately administered fund, which he'd worked out with Ellen over 3 months of conversations that Nora had not been party to, and which Raymond had declined to discuss in detail until everything was final. The number that appeared in her account was $122 million. She sat in the library in Bremerton, at one of the public computers in the reference section, and looked at the number for a long time. The same library where she'd pulled microfilm records of the Beaumont's decommissioning ceremony. The same computer she'd used to look up the 1987 maintenance manual references. The same reference section where she'd read about submarine construction while her dollar store soup sat in her bag. She sat there for about 15 minutes, not doing anything, just sitting with the number and what it meant and what it didn't mean and what it was going to require of her. Then she logged out and walked out of the library and called Raymond. "I saw it," she said. "Good," he said. "How are you?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "That's the right answer," he said. "Come over when you're ready. I made coffee." Raymond's house was 8 blocks from the museum lot. A small craftsman with a wood-burning stove and a bookshelf that ran the full length of one wall, and he'd been living in it alone for 12 years since his wife passed. He had a daughter in Portland and a son in Tacoma, and grandchildren he photographed on his phone and showed Nora when she visited, which she did most Sundays now, the habit having formed slowly over the months of the legal proceedings without either of them quite deciding to form it. It was just the shape that things had taken. She sat at his kitchen table, and he poured coffee, and they talked for 2 hours about what came next, which was a conversation they'd been having in fragments for months, and which was now, with the settlement finalized, ready to be completed. She took the house on a Tuesday in March, which was the earliest the paperwork could be completed, and moved into it with the contents of 2 suitcases and a backpack, which was everything she owned except the things she'd bought since November, and which fit into a borrowed truck for a single trip from the motel room above the hardware store that she'd rented for the past 4 months with the money from the cleaning jobs. The house was small by most standards and large by the standards she'd been applying to spaces for the past several years. 3 rooms on the ground floor, 2 bedrooms upstairs, a backyard that was more mud than grass in March, but which had the bones of something that had once been tended and could be tended again. A view of the sound from the upstairs window at the right angle, between 2 other houses, a strip of gray-blue water that changed color with the weather. She unpacked the 2 suitcases into the bedroom and put the backpack on a hook by the front door and stood in the kitchen, which had exactly 1 cup in a cabinet and 1 plate on a shelf, and thought for a moment about what she was standing in. Not just the house. The accumulated consequence of a gap in a fence and a hatch that opened and a wheel that moved and a letter from a dead commander and a man with a key ring who had been waiting for the right person to come through. She thought about her mother's apartment, the cedar candle on the windowsill, the light through the glass in December. She thought about the garbage bag and the $1,200 and the congratulations that felt like a door closing. She thought about the Tacoma parking structure and the 3 in the morning clarity and the word she'd been avoiding for a month finally arriving. Then she thought about all of it forward rather than backward, which she was still learning to do, the habit of forward thinking being newer than the habit of the other kind. She thought about the application submitted to Tacoma Community College, to which she'd received an acceptance letter the previous week. On paper, she'd read 4 times before she filed it. She thought about the program she'd been spending 3 months designing in legal structure consultations with Ellen, the Housing and Transition Support Program for youth aging out of foster care, the one that wouldn't send checks, but would put people in rooms with other people and teach them the practical knowledge that the system assumed you would somehow acquire on your own. She thought about the 41 names on the shelter wait list and the 40% statistic, and about the fact that statistics were just collections of individual cases, and that individual cases responded to individual intervention, and that the aggregate changed when you changed enough of the individual cases, and that this was therefore both a small thing and the only kind of thing that actually worked. She made a cup of coffee in the kitchen of her house and drank it standing at the window that didn't quite have the right angle for the sound, close but not quite, and thought, this is enough. This is exactly enough. Then she called Raymond and told him about the house, and they talked for 40 minutes about the Foundation's grant applications and the Beaumont's restoration timeline and a new documentary film team that had requested access to the boat and which Raymond was evaluating with his characteristic measured skepticism. She told him she was coming over on Sunday. He said he'd have coffee ready. Raymond had decided what to do with his portion before the ruling came down. The fund he'd established was named the Ashworth Foundation, and its mandate was the support of veterans experiencing housing instability and the documentation of Cold War naval history through partnerships with university archives. He'd spent more time on the mandate language than on any other aspect of the settlement, which was characteristic of him. He wanted to be right. He wanted to last. What about you, he said. Nora wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She'd been thinking about this since before the ruling, working through it the way she worked through practical problems, methodically testing each option for its actual weight rather than its apparent weight. She'd talked to Ellen about legal structures. She'd talked to a financial advisor that Ellen had recommended and who had the patience to explain things 3 times without appearing to find this unusual. She'd sat in the torpedo room of the Beaumont twice during the legal proceedings, when the hearings had been draining and she'd needed to think clearly, and the boat had provided the same service it had always provided, quiet and shelter, and the particular perspective that came from being enclosed in something that had survived for longer than you'd existed. She had a list. It was a practical list rather than a grand one, which was how she'd arrived at most of the good decisions in her life. The first item on the list was a house, specifically a house in Bremerton, specifically on the eastern side of town near the waterfront, because she had decided that her life was here for now and she wasn't going to start it by leaving. The second item was Tacoma Community College, deferred since August of last year, no longer deferred. The third item was more complicated and had required the most thought. I want to set up something for kids aging out of the system, she said. Not a charity, not a fund that sends checks. Something actual. Housing assistance, yes, but also the things that nobody tells you. How to calculate what things actually cost, how to build credit from nothing, how to talk to landlords when you have no rental history, how to navigate the gap between working and stable. She paused. The 40% statistic. I want to work on that number. Raymond looked at her. His expression was not surprise. It was something older than surprise, the expression of someone who had spent 11 years watching a museum lot and cultivating a journalist contact and maintaining a tamper-evident seal and waiting, and who had arrived at a moment they'd constructed very carefully and had found that it looked exactly as they'd hoped. Ashworth would have approved, he said. I hope so, she said. He wrote the letter to someone who'd know what to do with what he'd left. I want to deserve the description. The night before the ruling came down, she slept in the house on Bremerton's east side with the window cracked despite the October cold because she'd gotten used to certain kinds of air and certain kinds of quiet. She lay in the dark and thought about Ashworth writing the letter, about Raymond maintaining the documentation through 3 decades and 2 deaths and 11 years of foundation board meetings and county council hearings about scrap value. She thought about what it cost to wait for the right thing rather than settling for the available thing. She'd spent 4 months and 21 days being available. Squeezed through fences, worked overnight shifts, stretched dollar store soup across cold mornings in a metal torpedo room. Availability wasn't nothing. It was, in fact, the foundation of most of what was worth having. You couldn't find a thing waiting for you if you weren't in the place it was waiting. But the lesson she kept returning to was a different one. It was Ashworth's lesson, written on a manual typewriter in 1993 for a person he'd never meet. That building something for a future you couldn't see was not a gamble. It was a form of precision. You aimed at what you believed in, and you built toward it, and you trusted that the future was the kind of thing that rewarded that kind of precision if you were honest about what you were building toward. She'd been that kind of future. She intended to be that kind of past. In the morning, Ellen called with the ruling, and Nora sat on the floor of her mostly empty living room and listened to the summary and said thank you and hung up and sat there for a while in the quiet with the particular quality of light that came through east-facing windows in October mornings in Bremerton, golden and slightly hazy, the light her mother would have called the best light of the day. She thought it probably was. She thought about the gap in the fence and the hatch and the wheel and the letter in her pocket and the number in her bank account and the house on the east side and the registration at Tacoma Community College and the 41 names on the shelter wait list and the 40% statistic and everything she intended to do about it. She thought about all of that, and then she let it go, because the morning light was doing something particular through the east-facing windows, and it only lasted about 40 minutes, and she was going to be present for it. The Beaumont's preservation was secured 6 months after the settlement, through a combination of the Ashworth Foundation's first major grant and a matching contribution from the State Historical Society that materialized once the boat became the most famous submarine in the country. Raymond negotiated the terms himself, with the patience of someone who had been doing this at smaller scale for 11 years and was now simply working with larger numbers. The Foundation Board was reconstituted with 12 members, including 3 naval historians, 2 preservation specialists, 2 veterans representatives, and Raymond Cho, who accepted the chair without apparent irony. The boat opened for tours the following spring. School groups, veterans, organizations, naval history researchers, people who had read Claire Donahue's original story and the book she published 14 months later and who wanted to stand in the space where it had happened. They came through the conning tower hatch and down through the control room and through the hatches in sequence. And the guides who led them explained the history of the Beaumont and the Cold War and the particular decision that a commander had made one night in April 1982 in the North Pacific. The forward torpedo room was on the tour. The sealed compartment was accessible to guided groups only and required advanced scheduling, and there was a waiting list that ran 6 months out. Inside the compartment, the wooden crating was still in place, the space preserved as it had been found, the 8 crates now empty and displayed open, their interiors visible. One gold bar was there, the one Nora had lifted and replaced, donated by her to the foundation and displayed in a case with a placard that explained what it was and where it had come from and what had happened to the rest of them. On the wall of the compartment, mounted in a frame that a preservation specialist had built to archival specifications, was a reproduction of the last page of Ashworth's letter. The original was with the university archive that had acquired Raymond's full documentation. The reproduction was for the people who came through on tours, so they could read in Ashworth's words what he'd been trying to do and why, and decide for themselves whether he'd gotten the calculus right. Nora was present for the first tour. She stood in the compartment with a group of 8 people, a mix of school students and adults, and listened to the guide explain the history, and watched the faces of the people as they heard the story for the first time. The students leaned forward. One of the adults, a woman in her 50s, read the reproduction of Ashworth's letter twice, and then stood for a long moment looking at the empty crates. Nora didn't introduce herself. She was there as a visitor. The guide knew who she was and had offered to give her a private tour beforehand, and she declined because this was not her story to be separate from. It was a story that had started before her and would continue after her, and the most honest position she could take in it was the one she'd always occupied, standing in the space, paying attention, understanding what it was asking of her. She went back through the boat on her own after the tour group had moved on, the way she'd moved through it in November, slowly, hands and headlamp, testing floors and reading the quality of the dark. The control room with its frozen compass. The engine room with its truck-sized diesels. The crew quarters with the empty photograph frame that was still there because the preservation team had been instructed to leave everything as found. She stood in front of that frame for a moment and thought about what it had once held and what had happened to it, and what it meant that someone had taken it with them when they left. She went back to the forward torpedo room and sat on the lower bunk that had been her bed for the first 3 weeks of her life in Bremerton. The same bunk in the same space, the sleeping bag long gone, the metal frame the same. She sat there in the dark for a few minutes with her headlamp off, listening to the complete absence of wind. She thought about the night she'd come through the fence with $6.43 and a sleeping bag that wasn't enough. She thought about the wheel that had moved under her hands. She thought about Raymond Cho, standing in the museum lot with a key ring and a veteran's cap and 36 years of something extremely heavy finally ready to be set down. She thought about Commander David Ashworth at his desk in 1993 with his manual typewriter, writing a letter to no one and to everyone, and about what it meant to build something for a future you couldn't see because you believed the future was worth building for. She sat in the bunk in the dark for a long time, and then she turned on her headlamp and stood up and went back through the hatches, one by one, ducking and rotating through each opening with the easy fluency of a person who had learned the geometry a long time ago and whose body remembered it perfectly, and came up through the conning tower hatch into the gray spring afternoon. The museum lot was empty, and the sound was visible beyond the fence line, gray-blue and wide, and somewhere on the other side of it, in an office at Tacoma Community College, there was a registration for the fall semester with her name on it. On the east side of Bremerton, there was a house with a view of the water that she had signed papers on 3 weeks ago. In Pete's coffee shop, Dale was probably working through his crossword at the pace of someone making the experience last. She climbed down the ladder from the conning tower and stood on the Beaumont's hull for a moment, the same hull she'd stood on 11 months ago with her hands cold and her options narrower than they had ever been, and looked out at the water. She thought about possibility, the word she'd chosen when she couldn't afford the bigger one. It had been enough. It had been exactly enough. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.